Hi everyone. We're moving on to our final topic in 640, and we're going to be talking and thinking about the RTI model or a tiered system for intervention or instruction in a school. With that usually comes assessments and lots of assessments and interpreting those assessments and keeping track of all that data. I want you to right now to put on your specialist lens. So whether you are or aren't already working as a reading specialist or as a ESL specialist in your school, I want you to put on that lens and let go of the classroom teacher lens for a minute, because that's the degree that you're seeking. That's why you're in this class. So we're going to be looking at it through that lens today. I also want you to think about the various places that you've worked in and what has and has not worked in terms of RTI or tiered instruction in your school. There are different ways of pulling this off, and frankly, there is not one perfect way to do this. So that's not the point of this presentation, to figure out the best way to do RTI, because it's so dependent on which population you're serving and the kind of staff and expertise that you have in your school. So let's come to it with all that background knowledge from our work experience, and let's put on our specialist lens as we think about this all. So let's think about what RTI isn't. So it's not just one period of the day. It's not like, oh, it's 12 o'clock, this is when we do our interventions. No, it's not rigid to just one period a day, although there are usually schedules involved in thinking about the response to intervention model. We don't want to just think of it as something that fits into this tiny nugget of time during the day, because that's probably not going to solve many problems. It's also not just this one-size-fits-all extra help. So if your district is just buying a plan and putting it on top of all your struggling students, that might not be the best way to approach it either. The intervention groups are not fixed. That means it doesn't stay the same way all year. The children who are in that group in September may or may not still be in an intervention group in the spring. And if they still are in an intervention group, it's possible that other people have come in and out during the year, depending on their progress. RTI is not only provided by specialists. Classroom teachers need to be involved in this as well. It can't just be this magic fix of seeing a reading teacher or an ESL teacher. Interventions work best when all the teachers on the team are committed to this plan, including special ed. It helps to have special ed involved too. Not all about endless data collection, which is what happens a lot of times, is that schools take on these new assessments and they get consultants and it becomes all about color coding the data, and we got all tied up in that, and then the big meetings, and then that doesn't really do anything to change our day-to-day. It just feels like we're doing extra worksheets with markers and crayons. So that too is not what RTI is. Data collection, coding kids, grouping kids, that's all a very big part of it, but only if it serves a purpose, only if it helps us plan our instruction. It's not just for certain kids, it's a tiered model for instruction, so everybody in the building is involved in RTI, whether they're a tier 1, 2, or 3 child. It's not just something for elementary school, not just something for reading, although I am a reading person, you know that. This is RTI can be used to deliver math instruction and behavioral supports as well. So then, what is RTI? Okay, the initials RTI stand for Response to Intervention. It is basically a tiered model of instruction. So it starts with high quality instruction in general ed. So that means everybody in our general ed classroom should have access to really quality instruction, whether we're talking about reading or math, whatever. So when schools want to fix academic problems and patterns that they have, the #1 place to insert yourselves as reading coaches, as curriculum support specialists, would be in the classrooms, because that's our first line of defense. We can solve a lot of problems by doing really good work in the classroom. But that's not enough for all of our students. Some of our students require more specialized and tailored instruction. That's where the role of the reading specialist, math specialist, and even SPED teachers can come in as they work on what we call, tier 2 intervention. And ideally, this shouldn't just be the specialists. The classroom teachers need to be involved in that too, and the classroom teachers might be the ones carrying out some of that Tier 2 instruction. Likewise, Tier 3, the highest tier with the most targeted and strategic instruction, may or may not be given by the special educators. Not every special ed student is so severe that they would need Tier 3, some are in Tier 2, and some children who, for whatever reason, haven't been picked up for an IEP might be in Tier 3 doing really targeted and strategic work with a reading specialist. So teachers, specialists, and SPED teachers, those roles are not necessarily Tiers 1, 2, and 3. Those are just the building professionals, and they arrange themselves in all different ways depending on the school and the schedule and the needs of the population. But the tiered instruction is one thing, and then the humans involved are another thing, and then those can blend in whatever the best way possible is. Teachers must be flexible. Administrators must understand that teachers should be flexible and support teachers in doing that. Just because it's always been, this is my caseload, I'm staying this way, that's not going to work, because there are ways to solve problems more efficiently in dynamic ways, and so we need to be flexible as humans, as people, to try to figure out what makes the most sense, not just what we're most comfortable with. Yes, RTI does involve a lot of assessments because, of course, we're progress monitoring our students. We want to make sure that these interventions that we're running are actually working, that they're effective. So something like the Dibbles or Easy CBM or Ames Web, those are quick little dipsticks where you can take the temperature of your student, so to speak, and you can see if they're making progress or not. That doesn't tell us why they're struggling. It doesn't tell us if they are eligible for special ed. No, those assessments only give us a dipstick if a student is on the right course and is making ambitious gains. If they're not making ambitious gains, then we need to think about what's getting in the way. Are there outside factors getting in the way, like attendance, or does our instruction need to be more strategic and targeted for that child? So it involves problem solving. We can't just blindly look at data and know exactly what to do. We have to think of the child and the context and the situation. And we have to work with the other adults in our school to kind of unpack this. So the classroom teacher might have some really valuable insights that the data doesn't show us. Or the reading specialist might have really detailed information of how they respond to teaching in the moment that the data doesn't show us. So we want to use all that information to understand and make sense of our students when we're thinking about grouping them, when we're thinking about who needs to perhaps get tested for special ed, and all sorts of things. Special ed is a part of this. That's a part of public schools. So RTI, that data that's kept, all the note-taking that the specialists and the classroom teacher are doing during their small groups, and of course all the progress monitoring data, all of that history can be part of the package that's presented to the team when we're determining if a child is eligible for special ed or not. Because if they're just barely keeping their head above water and they're like bottom of the barrel, low average, but they've had 3 years of intensive Tier 2 instruction, that shows us that we're doing all of our best things and we're just keeping them at the bare minimum, like 30th percentile. That's alarming. So RTI data and information is often not used in SPED meetings, but it certainly should be. It's also a framework, not a recipe. So you can't just look at an RTI chart and be like, great, that's the plan. Those are the roles for the teachers in my school. That's the schedule we're going to use. No, think of it as a framework, and you need to put that onto your school with your staffing and your students and your testing materials, and then you make sense of it. So on this slide, I'm providing you with a visual that will help you to understand what I talked about on the previous slide. So here we have it, Tier 1. You see all of the students in our school are receiving Tier 1 instruction in their general ed classrooms. And that should be high quality whole group and small group instruction. Districts should think really carefully about the programming that they want to use for Tier 1 instruction. They should be training the teachers in structured literacy so that all students, 100% of students, have access to direct and explicit, not just phonics, but all elements of literacy, including writing and spelling and breaking down vocabulary and comprehension. We want our Tier 1 classrooms to be the best of the best. Ideally, that will minimize the number of children who need to move up the ranks and be part of Tier 2 and Tier 3. Now, no matter where you work, there are children who are biologically predisposed to struggle with reading, writing, and language. So we will always have Tier 2 and Tier 3 because dyslexia, dysgraphia, they exist and they're fairly common in our population, in our species. So, but Tier 2 and Tier 3 can be especially large if you work in a high needs area. So if you have children with attendance issues, if you have children who have a poor oral language because during early childhood, they sat in front of a TV for 4 years. If you have children who just moved to this country and are experiencing a temporary delay while they make sense of the English language. Perhaps students who came in from a traumatic situation, whether they're native English kids or non-native speakers, there's all sorts of other ways children's learning can get interrupted. So Tier 2 and Tier 3 could be bigger in a high needs area where they're serving populations with greater needs. So the numbers could look different at different schools, but always we want to invest a lot of money, training, and thought into what our Tier 1 looks like. Tier 2 is typically where the specialists come in, but classroom teachers can do some Tier 2 groups as well. These would be more complex and targeted. The content in these groups wouldn't just be a double dose of the curriculum because that's not usually specific enough. That can kind of happen in Tier 1 instruction. You do your teaching of your phonics or whatever, and you pull aside that group to do it again in a smaller fashion. Yeah, that's fine. But Tier 2 would actually be the teacher or the reading specialist or ESL teacher understanding the little skill areas that are weak and designing interventions to target those. Tier 3 is what we do when we see that their progress monitoring scores, they're making progress, but they're just not ambitious enough to close that gap. They're just kind of like trucking along. It might be steady or slow or little progress, and that makes us think, okay, there's something bigger going on. We need to take a much closer look. That's when the teacher might comb through and do deeper assessments like the ones we use for the case study project here, and do like a thorough comb through of the child's skills to see where the breakdown is. Perhaps this child would even be moved forward for special ed testing as well. But not as many people should be up at Tier 3, of course. Now notice how I didn't write special ed anywhere on here, because you're going to have children in all 3 tiers that could be special ed. There could be a child who's special ed for one reason, but with reading or writing, they're on grade level and they're just receiving Tier 1 instruction. So special ed status does not have to do with where they are on here, although obviously you're likely to see, because reading difficulties are so prevalent, you're likely to see a lot of students, a lot of special ed students in Tier 2 or Tier 3. Now I'm going to have you pause and read this article, 7 Ways to Kill RTI. So I've worked in a school as a 2nd grade teacher, 3rd grade teacher, and a reading specialist. So I understand, and those were all 3 different schools. So I've worked in private, a wealthy public school, and in urban and working class public school system. So I'm aware of multiple different ways of how districts pull this off or their philosophies on RTI. I've worked with a lot of professionals, butted heads with a lot of people thinking that I knew everything. And so this article, I think, it's a very quick read, and it sort of captures the real-time issues that happen in schools and that undermine our best efforts to do tiered intervention. Probably by now, at the time I'm recording this, it's 2020, and probably by now you've worked in a school and RTI just seems like, ugh, well, that was just another thing that didn't work. Things that don't work, well, it depends, but in this case of RTI, things that don't work, it's often because we're misunderstanding and misusing them. So read this article, then go over to the discussion board and you'll see a prompt and you can share your response there. Before we move forward, I do want to address that there are varying definitions for differentiation out there, and I want to make sure we're all using the same terminology as we move forward. So the purpose is not for me to discredit these definitions, but I just want to say for the purpose of structured literacy in RTI that's using structured literacy, we're going to be talking about the third one on the list here. Okay, so let's go through the other ones and talk about why they are not going to connect to what we're talking about. So Tomlinson, who's at a UVA, I believe, developed that original idea of differentiation in terms of the final product that students can produce can be different based on their needs or the way that they learn. So, for example, instead of having everyone write an essay at the end, a child could present their knowledge orally. So depending on what you're working on, if you're doing a social studies project, perhaps, yeah, in third grade, that would be acceptable to have a child present their knowledge orally instead of in a written essay or report. Yet we don't always, for everything, give this sort of option for different kinds of outcomes. Even if our learning objectives are the same for all kids, in terms of the content that we learned, yes, sometimes we can shift the final project, but we don't want to just not teach people how to read and write because it's hard for them. So that's totally acceptable to have different kinds of ways to show your knowledge, but that's something different than what we're talking about right now. Fontes and Pinnell and the capital G guided reading, that's something different than lowercase gr guided reading. Fontes and Pinnell, the balanced literacy, Lucy Calkins' Writer's Workshop, Reader's Workshop, all of that is about matching children to text at their assessed level. And then with Writer's Workshop, of course, all the students are writing on their own and you're supposed to magically know where everybody is on the writing continuum and conference with them regularly to propel them forward. That's a big task. So there's actually no research to suggest that matching students with books at their Fontes and Pinnell guided reading level does anything to move them forward. So that's just something to think about. I said I wasn't going to be negative about any of them, but I am a little bit negative there. Small group reading, doing lowercase gr guided reading is one thing, but the Fontes and Pinnell model, there's actually not research saying that that does anything to move students. Now let's talk about the third one, Walpole and McKenna. That was a book that we used to require for this class, but no longer do. We're welcome to look it up. So this is the differentiation definition that we're going to use for our framework here today for this work. So that is referring to instruction that targets needs directly. It has this idea of a developmental model, and it's a supplement to high quality classroom instruction. So there it is right there in the last phrase. There's already that beautiful, impressive, thoughtful tier 1 instruction happening with a knowledgeable teacher who knows what they're doing, who's already noticing the patterns of their struggling students and able to connect with the specialist or whoever about them. Yet also we have instruction here that targets specific needs. That means the teacher, the classroom teacher, the reading specialist, ESL, SPED, whoever, they need to know what reading and writing and spelling is in order to see those specific weaknesses. As you know, there are some assessments that just give us a random letter about the student's abilities, and then there are some assessments which show us where on that developmental continuum the student is. So think about the assessments you use for the case study project. You would have seen exactly where the breakdown happens with spelling, exactly where the breakdown happens with phonology, exactly where the breakdown happens with decoding different word patterns. The oral reading fluency from Dibbles only tells you if they're at grade level or not. It doesn't tell you anything else. So that's important that we know if they're at grade level, but it doesn't show us the itty bitty needs. We have to use our teacher brains, all that knowledge we have of the English language, and then we have to either by looking at students' work or by doing those assessments, understand where they are in the developmental continuum so we can plan that intervention for them. It's really quite simple, but just so happens the English language is so complex and we have so many students in front of us. So although the idea of it is very basic and I'm sure you can wrap your head around it, doing this kind of work is hard. It really is hard. But the more student profiles you see, the more opportunities you have to use this lens to look at kids, you start to notice patterns faster and it becomes less laborious for you to figure out, oh, where are they falling apart? You can look at their spelling errors and immediately that comes alive to you and you'll notice the patterns. So that's what we're trying to do through this class is train you so that it starts to become second nature to you. When you look at a child read and write, when you look at their assessment scores, you can make sense of them and then ultimately plan and carry out that intervention, that differentiation that they require. So I think I've said this a couple times already, one way or another, but yes, all students are receiving differentiation, small group attention in their high quality tier 1 classroom. There's a classroom teacher, may or may not be an aide in the classroom, maybe there's some push-in happening, who knows, but it doesn't matter. The classroom teacher, that's just part of good teaching, knows her students and differentiates a bit to her ability based on her knowledge of them. Yet, as the tiers get higher, and that's why all of you are in this class because you want to be a specialist, or you at least want to have the knowledge of a specialist, that role, you are working with the students who definitely need targeted instruction. So a classroom teacher is working with everyone, doing your basic small group instruction to differentiate as needed, and then we take it up a notch for those tier 2 kids. So they get a little bit of small group instruction from their teacher, but those tier 2 kids also get the intervention from a reading specialist. It's not one or the other because they can't lose their tier 1 to get tier 2. So that's a mistake that schools often make, is that it's a whole group lesson and then everyone goes off into their groups. And those tier 2 kids, they're not getting tier 1 and tier 2 anymore. Everybody should be getting the help from their classroom teacher. And then on top of that, some kids get more. I know, very hard to schedule. How do you pull it off? This is where working together makes sense. Because if the reading specialist or ESL teacher is planning her targeted lessons, how nice would it be for them to share that with the classroom teacher so the classroom teacher isn't also using a lot of time to plan those lessons. So that, differentiation group and the specialist, maybe that time could look sort of similar and they're getting it twice as much instead of just one time, if that makes sense. Okay, we're getting to the stuff I love. I love assessment, I really do, because this is the start of problem solving. If we want to solve the problems, the learning problems of our students, we have to understand them deeply. And assessment is something that is a big part of my job at my learning studio. That's what students on their way in, they work with me. I assess them for an hour and write a report. And I love uncovering who they are as a reader and writer and speller. I love figuring that out because that's the very first step in solving the problem. And when we put in a lot of effort to understand the problem, solving it is not as challenging because we have the plan, we have the direction ahead of us. We know what we're doing. So we can't just differentiate, we can't plan our intervention groups unless we know who we're working with. So first of all, which students are we going to assess? Everybody is getting the September, January, May benchmark testing. Great. So everybody gets that. Then there might be some students who we know they're struggling, so we put them in the intervention groups, right away in September. weeks go by, we do some progress monitoring, okay, weeks go by. And then there are some students who, they really, in reading groups with their teacher and with the specialist, everybody's noticing that there's a gap or they're not making progress like the other kids. And the data from the progress monitoring is showing the same thing. They're not making the gains that we want them to make. So those are the students that we might do a deep dive with. We would pull out our Kilpatrick PAST test. We would pull out the quick phonics screener, the primary or elementary spelling inventory. Again, we already have our DIBELS data or Ames Web or Easy CBM. So we already have that progress monitoring data. So now we want to deep dive through their skills. This will help us to figure out what their instructional needs are. Now, we're not going in blind because if these are the students we already work with, we have a lot of knowledge from the classroom teacher or ourselves as the specialist. Plus, then we do our deep dive going through with the assessments. We also want to consider what we're teaching them. Are we just doing full speed ahead with the curriculum, or have we really slowed down and zoomed in on their specific needs already? If we're already doing really targeted heavy duty instruction, then how can we increase that? Does this mean that we reach out to the special ed teachers at the school? Does this mean that we meet with this child more frequently or do something more intensive? So there's a lot of questions that we need to ask, but basically it's going to start with understanding the kid, and we can do that through assessment. And just briefly, when we talk about assessment, there's all different kinds. So we've already talked about screening, which happens, 3 times a year. That's our quick dipstick. It gives us very little specific information, but it does a very good job of painting a big picture of where the students in our classroom or grade, where they are in a relation to benchmark. Diagnostic testing is going to go subdivides across a broad area. So this is going to be something that could be, yes, this is like special ed testing as well, but let's push that aside and let's think about, as specialists, the kinds of probes that we would use. So we would look at like just their nonsense word reading through the quick phonics screener or DIBELS Deep. It doesn't say it on your slide, but the Kilpatrick PAST test would also be diagnostic. The elementary and primary spelling inventories, also diagnostic, because they zoom in and they show us all the little skills that go into that area, and we're able to zoom in and diagnose where that problem is. Progress monitoring is usually related to our screeners. Whatever we're doing for screening, we're probably doing the same material for progress monitoring for some of our students, just using a different form of it. So we're not using the same oral reading story all year long. We use a different version at each screener. And of course, we have our outcome testing. So that could be things like MCAS or Access. That's more like big picture, how the whole school, how the grade, how the students are doing, but that's not really giving us our day-to-day info. So just wanted to clarify, when I'm talking about assessments, we really care about those diagnostic ones. That's what's helpful to us. Of course, progress monitoring gives us info too, because it helps us track throughout the year. Okay, you don't have page 19 because this is from the Walpole and McKenna book that we no longer use in this class. But I love this analogy about planning interventions. The authors call it an instructional diet, and that really helped me when I was starting as a reading specialist understand how I should plan my groups. So you know I'm all about templates. In previous sessions of this course, I shared with you some templates to use for small group instruction. So those templates, you'll notice, not all my first grade groups have the same template. Some had a heavy dose of phonemic awareness and early blending skills. Others had a heavy dose of sight words and fluency. So it depends on your student and their needs what that intervention group and goal will look like. And of course, those goals are meant to be fluid. And I might keep them like that for 6 weeks and then either shift midway if I see the need for it, or I might wait till my progress monitoring data comes in and combine that with my notes and observations from working with the kids and then make a shift. But the idea is we're thinking and planning that instructional diet based on what we see that the kids need. So a dietitian is a specialist, right? They are experts on what certain people need to eat. If you are diabetic, if you are celiac, all different needs, right? There's not this, if you have heart disease, there's not the same diet that's perfect for everybody with a health need. So same with our students. Just because they're struggling with reading, spelling, writing, oral language, there's not just one perfect instructional diet. Structured literacy would be the big overarching thing, just like we know fresh fruits and veggies, ideally, and minimal processed foods would be the best diet for anyone. We know, like in general, structured literacy, but which elements of structured literacy are we delivering to this child in particular? So you can kind of look at that little picture there with the different items on the plate, and that might help you picture like the templates that you would plan for each little reading group that you're running. I will send you this link to watch separately. Okay, I realize this might not be perfectly readable for you, but let's give it a try. So what does it all look like? If we're thinking about this assessment over the course of the year, how are we doing this as classroom teachers and as specialists? Well, for one, September, January, May, that's when we have, I wrote CBM, that means curriculum-based measure. That's like benchmark testing. That's screening. So that would be DIBELS, AIMS-Web, Easy CBM, whatever you use. Your school might use something like the DRA or Fontes and Pinnell in place of the DIBELS, and you probably by this point have realized, well, that's not really giving me any specific information about which components of reading the child is struggling with. You're listening to them put it all together, sure, that's great, but an oral reading fluency measure, you could do the same thing, and you can take a running record right there on your oral reading fluency sheet as well. So if you're looking for the comprehension questions, great, you can add that piece in and use the DRA or the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark, but you probably know by now that that is kind of wishy-washy and there's actually not data supporting that that gives us any kind of powerful information about students. So let's pretend your school's doing the right thing. They're doing DIBELS, let's say. In September, January, and May, they're making sense of that data at the fall data meeting. They plan the groups or those instructional diets, and they plan tier 1 and tier 2. Sorry about that line. So then October, November, December, you can kind of see the same thing is happening. We have progress monitoring, okay? Let me see if I can make this thinner. Here we go. So we're doing progress monitoring. We're communicating with the team. Oh, I'm very bad with this. We make adjustments. Maybe we have a problem-solving team meeting, which would be like student study meeting for strugglers. And then maybe we're bumping up to some kids to tier 3. Probably not a lot of that going on in October, frankly, because schools are usually a little delayed in getting things up and running. Of course, classrooms are doing a good job with those first 6 weeks of school setting routines and expectations. But certainly in November and December, all of that is happening. There's never really a period where we're not in the middle of figuring things out, because you're always just done with your progress monitoring or screening and making your groups or adjusting your groups, or you're in the process of refining it and carrying it out and scheduling a problem-solving team. And you certainly are communicating with the grade level team every single week. Not a week goes by where a specialist should not be talking with their grade level team. So that's something that I want to really impress on you, because I know that's not how every school works, and that's not how it always worked when I worked in schools. But it's critical, and that's critical to your students' success. So we carry on with this whole rotation of progress monitoring, adjusting, communicating, until we get to January, where we pause and we do a whole reboot and we screen all of our students. Unfortunately, around January or February, I know that access testing also happens. At least I think that's when it happens. So that can kind of slow things down if the reading specialist or ESL specialist is involved with that kind of testing, because that takes them out of the loop for a little while with all the administrative tasks involved with testing. And then they have to carry, and then the intervention groups pick back up. But anyways, as you can see, we have February, March, April. It's all the same thing. It's not like there's ever a month where things just get turned off and we just go on autopilot. No, it's just always this cycle of progress monitoring, thinking about it, doing our weekly chit chats with our teachers, our classroom teachers. Ooh, there's the monthly problem solving team where we're looking at a few kids closely. Oh, there's special ed meetings here and there. So this cycle is ongoing, of course. Something I want to show, actually, let's use green here. In January, we have the opportunity to look at their growth rate, not just their scores, but their growth rate. Was their growth from September to January ambitious enough to close the gap? So it's not just are they making benchmark, or, oh no, they're behind benchmark. We're also thinking about, okay, they're behind benchmark, but wow, look at this growth rate. That is so amazing. We're doing the right thing. Let's keep going. Or, oh my gosh, I thought they were making progress, but it's like this slow progress and it's never going to be sharp enough to catch up to their peers. We got to do something different. So that growth rate data makes the scores come alive in a more important way. And again, we can do that at the end of the year too, and ideally have that information ready to go for the next grade so we can tell them who we're concerned about and they don't have to start from scratch in September. It probably goes without saying, but the role of a specialist, whether it's a reading specialist or an ESL specialist, well, they really vary. Obviously, the most important thing is planning and running interventions. Of course, that's really the most important thing. But there are other duties that you have to help make RTI effective in your school. So you might be helping out with the 3 big testing periods in September, January, and May. You might also have to help out with the access testing and perhaps even MCAS testing, which stinks because that gets in the way of your good work with interventions. You might be in charge of doing the progress monitoring for the students that you service to take some of the weight, off the teachers, the classroom teachers. You might be the person putting the data into the management system. Sometimes the classroom teachers have to do their benchmark testing in January, September, January, and May. But if that's something that's easy peasy for you and you can just like fly through it someday, that's really helpful because we want teachers to spend more time making sense of the data as opposed to the grueling task of collecting and inputting the data. That's slightly miserable. Some schools have Dibbles on like an iPad or an iPhone now, so that goes a little bit quicker and you don't have to manually plug it in anymore. If there's printing and preparing of data reports and any kind of previewing you can do so that when you get to the data meeting, everyone's not like, what does this mean? What's the point? If you can look at it ahead of time and make it come alive, that can be really useful to you and your team, and they might be more likely to use those data meetings in a productive way instead of just complaining about the process or complaining about kids. You also might be the one responsible for leading your data meeting. Maybe your principal will do that. Maybe there's a reading coach or a curriculum specialist who does that. But in a lot of schools, the reading specialist is a part of that as well. Or you could, if this is a strength of yours, kind of stand up and suggest that you take over this element of things. We want our data meetings to be less about color coding kids and putting kids into groups based on colors and numbers, and more about dynamic discussions of problem solving, not complaining, problem solving. And then I keep calling them problem solving teams, but that's also a child study team, a student study team, whatever that pre-referral process looks like at your school. I like the word problem solving teams just because that seems empowering. So you might be thinking, okay, well, if I'm supposed to be leading these data meetings, how can I make them productive instead of miserable for people? So I think it helps to, like I said, it helps to prepare so you already know what the themes and the trends and the needs are for that grade. Rather than going in blind, it helps to have a lot of the hard work and the hard thinking done ahead of time. So looking at the trends in the grade, some years it's a particularly hard or low grade and other years not. So that can be something to recognize and decide, okay, well, this year, yikes, we got a lot of kids who have trouble with XYZ or whatever the case may be. How are we going to deal with that this year or right now? When I was a reading specialist, there was a year where they had this trial program in kindergarten, and there was no letter naming taught that year in kindergarten. So that was pretty shocking when those kids got to first grade and the curriculums did not match, and first graders were supposed to know all their upper and lowercase letters and be sounding out words already and, hit the ground running with reading. They were not prepared to do that. Yet, this particular program did a ton of phonemic and phonological awareness. So this one year, we had kids that came in with really high sound skills, but very little letter knowledge or exposure to sounding things out. So that year, teachers had to adjust their tier 1 instruction to match. So thinking about a trend in a particular grade or even just a cohort of kids in that grade can be really fruitful, and you don't have to complain about it, endlessly, but you can just acknowledge it and then deal with it. Also, of course, during a data meeting, you might be talking about specific students, students that maybe just moved in and now you're getting to know them and working with them, or students who have been really lagging behind, or students who they came into intervention and then they just skyrocketed, and look at that, that's amazing. So it could be groups and cohorts, or it could be specific children you were discussing. This is the time when you propose the actionable items. So you make the plan. You as a reading specialist might already have an idea in your brain of what you want to happen, but the classroom teachers will be coming in as well with this information, and an ESL teacher as well as could be part of the picture. So ideally, any of the teachers who work with children in that grade should be there, because you're all talking together about how this is going to break down, how this plan is going to happen. There might be adjustments to tier 1 if there's a grade level issue, or if you have some training or materials that can support everyone, even if there isn't an issue, that could be a time where you present it. If there's some movement with how you're grouping your tier 2 and tier 3 kids, you're shifting that now. You have your schedules out, you have your lists, you're making those changes. Likewise, not only are you changing the groupings, but you might be making a shift in that instructional diet and telling the teachers, okay, I really noticed that students 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 need this kind of thing, so I'm going to insert this into our group, as opposed to students 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are making great progress. I'm going to put more pressure on them by including, sight words and phrasing into their work. So, and you might just have adjusted goals for specific students, not just, maybe not just groups. if you have materials that have come in, some, new thing that you have found, or an article. Not like anyone wants to be given an article at a data meeting, but this would be the time to, with care and with grace, influence the people that you're working with and support them. Not just, here, this will make your teaching better, or take this, I just bought this fancy thing on Teacher Pay Teachers. But no, really thinking about the specific problems that you need solved, and then, oh, great, I have these really practical resources that will help us to do this. Any kind of observation notes you have will also make things come alive. I found that it was very fruitful when I would take out my little notebook with my notes and share exact errors or aha moments that these children had, and I would share that with their teachers. And that was much more meaningful than just, yeah, they're not really making progress, or okay, they only scored a, 72 on their oral reading. More so, I mean, the scores are very important because they tell us, in relation to their peers and benchmark where they are. But more important than the scores and just those empty anecdotes are the very specific things that we can mention. I think that is really helpful and fruitful for conversations, and it also helps teachers to trust us as a specialist because they see that we're noticing itty bitty details about their students, and that feels good.